Welcome to the Lubar Center at Marquette Law School, where we are releasing the first of two releases this week from a new national survey by the Marquette Law School Poll. I'm Alan Borsuk. I'm a senior fellow here, and I'm part of the team that works on the poll. But more important, to my left is Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the poll, and that's the person we really want to hear from. Welcome, Charles.
Good to be here once again.
It's my impression that there's been an unusual amount of interest lately in the United States Supreme Court for who knows why. And that's what we're going to focus on here today. Give us a little bit of the background of the poll.
Yeah, we've been interested in the court for a while, not surprising in a law school, I suppose, but starting in 2019, we began doing national polls focused largely on the Supreme Court and some other political issues as well. Today we'll be talking about the court primarily. This is the ninth of the series of polls we've been doing on the court since 2019, and we see quite a few changes this time and over the last year or so in our results for the polls. So starting in 2019, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still on the court, into now with a different majority on the court and new appointments, and a host of very important, very provocative cases coming before the court and being decided. So it's a good time to be polling about the court, I'll say that.
Yeah, no kidding. So let's wade in. What do we find?
So the details are we were in the poll, in the field with the poll, July 5th through the 12th. So that was a few days after the court finished its term and handed down its last decisions. We interviewed 1,003 adults nationwide. That has a margin of error of plus or minus 4 percentage points. And people were interviewed from a national probability sample of addresses around the country and were interviewed online rather than by telephone. But it's a random sample of the public. It's not a volunteer sample, as some online polls still are.
There is a sharp change.
There is. Approval of the court has sharply declined, and from a not terribly low level. In March, before the draft opinion in the decision about Roe versus Wade was leaked, 54% of the public approved of the job the court was doing. That fell in May after the draft opinion leaked to 44% approval, but it fell again now following the reversal of Roe to just 38% in July. That's by far the lowest approval rating we've seen since we started polling on the court. And for a contrast, in September of 2020, just before Justice Ginsburg's death, 66% approved of the job the court was doing. But even a year ago, in July of 2021, approval was at 60%. Those high levels above the 50s were not atypical of the court in that period. So over this last 12 months, to go from 60% down into the 50s, then into the 40s, and now at 38%, is really a very substantial shift in perception of the court that we've seen in the wake of this year's decisions.
Well, let's talk about some of the things underlying that, starting with Roe v. Wade.
Well, approval of the court is closely tied to whether people supported overturning Roe or were opposed to that. In March, again, before the draft opinion leaked, of those who favored overturning Roe, 65% approved of the court, while 45% of those who were opposed to overturning Roe approved of the court. So there's a substantial gap there in approval based on opinion of Roe before we knew anything about the opinion. Following the leak, though, among those who wanted Roe overturned, approval rose to 84%, while among those who opposed striking down Roe, approval fell to just 25%. Now in July, following the actual reversal of Roe, those who are happy with that decision remain at 83% approving of the court. But those opposed to overturning it, approval has collapsed to just 11%. Those are dramatic changes, and what looked like a fairly large gap in March, but with even those opposed to overturning Roe not too far below 50%, is now down in barely double digits at 11%. So this is really remarkable for how much the opinion on this issue has shaped these views of the court, and in both directions. Those who wanted to see Roe overturned boosted their approval quite a bit, but those who oppose the reversal of Roe truly have collapsed in their approval of the court.
One might guess that this has something to do with party affiliation.
It does, though it's important to know that these effects of Roe hold up even when you control for party. So, unsurprisingly, party matters, but so does opinion of Roe. In this case, the polarization between Democrats and Republicans is really striking. In our current poll in July, 67% of Republicans approve, just 15% of Democrats approve.
This is approval of the court's performance overall, not just the Roe decision.
That's right.
Okay,
this is approval of the court overall. Independents' approval is at 39%. But even as recently as March, a slight majority of Democrats, 52%, approved of the job the court was doing. So seeing Democrats go from 52 in March down to 15 now also shows how much polarization in views of the court are also polarized along partisan lines. Let me just add for a second that even in the past year, we saw approval among Democrats and Republicans in some of the polls just about equal in their views of the court. So now to see this gap of 67 to 15, when we saw both of them in the upper 50s at the same time earlier in the year, is really quite telling about how polarizing the court's recent decisions have been on party terms.
Set aside the party labels and use the self-described statements from the people being polled as to whether they were conservative or liberal. What do we find then?
This political ideology has actually been one of the stronger divides in views of the court, even more so than party. But now that, too, is a much bigger gap. In March, the gap between those who were very conservative and very liberal in approval of the court was a pretty big 36 percentage points. But in July, it's gone to 75%, with 79% approval among the very conservative and 4%. I actually had to write that out. F-O-U-R, 4% approval among those who think of themselves as very liberal. Also among moderates, approval has fallen from 58% down to 29% in July. So it's not only liberals who've become more disapproving of the court, it's also moderates who have, while conservatives and those who are very conservative have become a bit more approving of the court. As with party, polarization is much greater than it was, but especially on the ideological dimension, that's a gigantic gulf between the ideological extremes of very liberal and very conservative.
How, if at all, is this showing up in terms of opinion on Roe and legalized abortion?
There we see very little shift in what policy or legal position people prefer. In this survey, 36% favor the court's decision to strike down Roe, 64% oppose it. In May, 31% favored overturning and 69% opposed. So there's about a 5-point shift there. It looks in our data like a lot of that came from people who said they didn't have an opinion about Roe in May, now having an opinion and being a bit more likely to say they favor the court's decision. But in any case, that shift is not a statistically significant shift. It does look like maybe support for the court's decision is a little bit higher, but not by very much and not something you want to take to the bank.
And returning to the party labels, what was opinion on overturning Roe?
Pretty sharp partisan differences. 71% of Republicans favor overturning, just 9% of Democrats. Independents also split 36 in favor of overturning Roe, 64 opposed. Those numbers are barely different from where they were in March, when it was 68% of Republicans that wanted to overturn and 8% of Democrats. So there's not been much change at all, certainly no major substantive shift in the party's views about what the court should have done about Roe.
Historically and generally, the court operates under less of a spotlight than the presidency or Congress. When we did our poll in May, as I recall, it was only 40% even then who had a strong knowledge of the leaked opinion. Right. What do we find now?
Yeah, more than double the percent who say they've heard a lot about this decision to overturn Roe. 81% said they've read or heard a lot about it. Hardly anyone says they haven't heard anything at all about it. And it is striking because, at least for us news junkies, the leaked opinion was a major story. Certainly caught the attention of every court watcher because it's so unusual for an opinion to leak. And yet less than half of the public said they had heard a lot about that in May, a couple of weeks after the leak occurred. But here, 81% saying they've heard a lot. That's a very, very high number for any court case. I don't think it's surprising that it's so high, but it does show even here the contrast between a really prominent news story concerning the court at 40% heard a lot versus an actual decision that's momentous and overturned a precedent of 49 years standing. That was much more attention-getting for the public.
Looking across the political spectrum, was anybody more interested or less interested?
Very little difference, actually, in awareness of the decision. It was over 3/4 of every partisan group said they had heard a lot, heard or read a lot. A little bit less with independents, and Democrats and Republicans pretty equal in their having heard a lot about the decision.
We've polled since 2019 on people's perception of the court as liberal, conservative, whatever. And for quite a while, it was kind of moderate to moderate conservative, the predominant opinion. Has that changed?
Yes, it has. But here, the change has been ongoing over these last 3 years rather than something that happened only after this decision concerning abortion came down. Back in 2019, just 5% said the court was very conservative, and fully 50% described the court as moderate. But in July, 7 times as many, 34%, say the court is very conservative, and less than half, just 21%, say it's moderate. And that shift is, I think, quite remarkable if you think that one of the reasons that in 2019 and 2020 we saw high levels, over 60% approval of the court, we saw relatively less partisan division over the court, wasn't that the court wasn't making important and sometimes conservative, sometimes liberal rulings, but that the public did see the court as relatively centrist at that time, maybe tilting a little bit more to the right. There were certainly more who said somewhat conservative rather than any level of liberal. But now, over this last 3 years, and especially over the last 12 months, we've seen this dramatic shift that continued in July to move even more than it had before. But those changes have been taking place for a couple of years now, not something that's only come here in the wake of the abortion decision.
But it's certainly rooted in facts about who's on the court now.
Absolutely. We both have had to change from a 5-4 conservative majority to a 6-3 majority. We've also seen more cases decided this year on that 6-3 conservative to liberal split than we saw in 2020, the previous year, the term that ended in the summer of 2021. During that time, while there were certainly, again, still some important cases that were ideologically divided, there were somewhat fewer of them than what we've seen this year. Finally, it's easy to go through big, important cases this year that also showed that 6-3 ideological divide. So I think it's both the shift in the nature of the court to 6 conservative rather than 5 conservative justices, but it's also because of the types of cases they've decided this year, and in choosing the way they've decided those cases, overturning Roe rather than incrementally changing it, I think those have a lot to do with the changing perception of the court.
Annie, get your gun.
Yes, we had a major gun rights decision. For the first time, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment protects the right to possess a gun outside the home. Previously, the court had only ruled on possessing a gun inside the home. Now, unlike the case of the decision on abortion, this decision has a majority favoring the ruling. 56% favor the court's decision to protect guns outside the home. 44% are opposed. That is a 10-point shift away from support for gun rights. In May, 66% were in favor and 34% opposed. So those in favor came down 10 points, those opposed went up 10 points. This is, of course, in the wake of shootings in Uvalde and other places around the country, and something of the rise of guns as an issue, and for that matter, Congress enacting a modest measure concerning guns. Nevertheless, unlike the abortion decision where close to 2/3 are opposed to that decision, on this one, significantly over half favor this decision of the court.
And the partisan breakdown on that?
Yeah, Republicans are just unanimous in their support of gun rights. 95% of Republicans favor this decision, as do 61% of independents. The odd people out here are Democrats, where only 18% of Democrats favor the decision. So if you think of the balance on opinion, majority opinion favors the side Democrats are on, but when it comes to guns, the majority opinion is very decidedly different from where Democrats stand on the issue. And I think that just 18% of Democrats in favor of the ruling versus 56% overall supporting the ruling is an example of where the parties differ so much on the issue of guns, even in the wake of school shootings and 4th of July parade shootings and so on.
From May to July, which is to say before and after that decision was issued, how did the partisan dynamics shift?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a shift. Independents and Democrats dropped a little bit, but I think the bigger point on partisanship on guns is this big divide that we see It's hard to tie any shift in opinion to shooting events around the country, for example. The salience of the issue may have gone up a bit, and it also may be the case that in the wake of those shootings, a few more people saw this decision as problematic, but again, not enough to undo the partisan or the overall majority in favor of this protection of gun rights.
But awareness of the decision wasn't in the Super Bowl level of Roe versus Wade.
No, in this case, 47% said they'd heard a lot compared to the 81% that we saw for the abortion decision. Just 16% said they'd heard nothing at all about this ruling. So in an average court term, this would probably pass as one of the more prominent court decisions. In the context of the abortion decision, though, it's pretty visible, but not anywhere close to where the abortion decision is.
Partisan awareness?
A little bit of difference. 46% of Republicans aware, but 57% of Democrats. I think this, again, touches on Democrats' opposition to the decision and Democrats' greater concern about gun violence in the country. If Republicans are more concerned about gun rights, Democrats are more concerned about gun violence. So these are two different aspects of the gun issue that touch the two partisan groups in rather different ways. Independents, as is typically the case, a little less aware at 41%, though that's still relatively high.
I can't say I'm too surprised to guess that households with guns were more supportive than those without guns.
They are. 72% of those with a gun in the household favored the ruling. But I think it's also interesting that 46% of those without a gun also favored the ruling. So here, unsurprisingly, gun owners are more pleased with the ruling. But it's not as if households without a gun are inimically opposed to the ruling. They're actually split about evenly on the issue.
There has been a series of Supreme Court decisions going back to 2002, I believe, was when they first said school vouchers to religious schools were okay. And that process of opening the door to public support of religious institutions, particularly schools, continues here.
It does, and we have seen a series of these rulings that are fairly obscure. If we were just talking about two headline issues, this is the one you really have to be paying attention to the court to notice and metaphorically at least go to the third or fourth page of the paper rather than the front page usually. What this case dealt with was a Maine law which provides tuition support for students to attend private schools, but bars that support being used for religious private schools. And so the court ruled that you couldn't provide this money in general to private schools, but still exclude religious private schools. This follows, as you say, in a chain of decisions, including some just over the last 2 or 3 years, in which state money that was restricted from being used in private education or religious education, the court has ruled those religious institutions must be afforded that support as long as it is otherwise available to other private schools. So a little bit in the weeds here, right? It won't be surprising that most people have not heard about this. 59% said they had not heard enough to have an opinion or hadn't heard anything at all about this issue. But among those who did have an opinion, the slightly more than 40%, 59% favored this extension of funding to religious schools, 41% were opposed. This also has been in keeping with questions we've asked in previous court terms that involved this extension of funding, and I think does reflect a general public willingness to extend funding to religious schools, at least in the circumstances that have been before the court, and with the proviso that maybe more than half of the public really haven't thought or heard anything about this issue until our survey nicely asked them about it. So we do our best to bring these things up for people.
The partisan breakdown on this issue.
Yeah. Again, we see the party differences you might expect. 87 support for religious funding among Republicans, 64 with independents, and just 28% among Democrats. We also see religious differences on this. Born-again Protestants have by far the highest support at 92%. Roman Catholics next at 79%, and mainline Protestants at 61%. So that's quite a sweep of the religious landscape, with all majorities in favor of this ruling. Those of other religions, which is a large category of what other religions include, are split evenly, 51% in favor. We don't have enough detail or enough respondents to be able to break down other religions better than that. Finally, the religious nones, those who have no religion, only 32% favor the ruling. And so here we see the religious versus secular divide in our politics in this issue, with, again, quite a gap. And it's a growing group of people who are without a religious faith, who are quite different from those with a religion of any kind.
We talked at the start about approval of the court's work. A second approach to that is, do you have confidence in the court?
And we ask this about the three branches of government. How much confidence do you have in the Supreme Court, in the Congress, and in the presidency as an office, not as the current occupant? Here, as with approval, confidence has fallen since 2019, from 37% very confident in the court down to 28%. While those with little or no confidence has more than doubled, from 20 to 44%. So this is a considerable decline in confidence of the court. If there's any bright spot for the court, it's that there's still a little bit more confidence in the court than in certainly Congress, which never fares well on this question, or the presidency. I don't think it'll surprise anyone that Congress doesn't do so well. Historically, the court has stood well ahead of the other two branches in confidence. This decline leaves it a little bit ahead of the others, but not nearly with the commanding advantage that it had in the past.
Polarization around confidence in the court.
That too has increased, as you would expect. Just as approval divided along party lines, the same thing is happening with the court. Confidence in the presidency, as surely we would all expect, varies depending on whether your party's in the White House or the other party's in the White House. So we've seen big swings by party in confidence in the presidency. Not so much change with Congress. That's not as one-sided. But with the court here, we've seen Democrats losing confidence a lot, while Republicans have held steady or gained confidence.
What motivates the justices? That's a question we've asked since 2019.
We've asked this for a long time, and the percentage, and we pose it as, what most motivates justices? Is it mainly politics or mainly the law? And we've seen a solid majority say mainly the law. 64% said that in 2019. But this July, that's fallen to less than a majority, 48% saying mainly the law, while mainly politics has risen from 35 to 52%. We also, in a little nuance, asked this question two different ways. One is what I just described about what motivates the justices implicitly as individuals? And people are a little more charitable to the justices. When we ask it in terms of the institution, what motivates the Supreme Court? Politics is more prominent in people's thinkings. 61% say mainly politics, 39% mainly the law. That's about 10% higher on mainly politics than when we ask it about the justices themselves. And so if you want to paint the court as viewed in a partisan terms, ask it about the institution. If you want to see it a little lower, ask it about the justices, but consistently about a 10-point gap between those two, with the institution being seen as more political. The justices, as we just saw, now have a majority saying they too are motivated by politics, but not quite the majority that you see for the institution.
We've also been asking since 2019 a question that was very much in the forefront of debate around abortion, which is how important is precedent?
And here, this is a question that was directly tied to the prospect of overturning Roe v. Wade in the past. Many nominees to the court were asked about their views of precedent. Now we've seen precedent overturned. But when we asked the public about that, precedent didn't weigh as heavily in their minds as the idea that the court should be able to overturn a decision that a majority of the court thought was wrongly decided. 33% now say you should follow precedent, but 66% say you should overturn a ruling that was wrongly decided. However, that is still quite a change. In 2020, just 18% said follow precedent and 81% said the court should overturn wrong rulings. I think here what you're seeing is following precedent is something that folks in the legal profession think about, folks that follow the court think about. But for most of us, almost all of the time, if we're asked should a wrong decision be fixed, most of us would say yes. Overturning Roe has driven home what it means to overturn a precedent. But even in the wake of that, we still see a solid majority saying the court should not be overly bound by precedent.
Well, how many times in the last couple of years have you heard people say we live in unprecedented times? So.
Indeed, indeed.
Oh, man. This abortion controversy has given new fuel to those who are opposed to overturning Roe and say, well, we should add more justices.
Right. That has still not got much traction. We see about an even split on expanding the court, 49 in favor, 51 opposed. We've seen very little change in this. Back in 2020 when we first asked, it was a little bit lower, about 43 or 4% were in favor of expanding the court. So that's only barely edged up over time, and we didn't see any dramatic change from May till July, just in the wake of the decision. So there are proposals for reforming or changing the court, but in terms of expanding the number of justices, that position has not broken through and has stayed roughly stalemated at pretty close to a 50-50 split.
I think it was Justice Gorsuch, in his opinion, said, we don't pay any attention to public opinion. What does the public think of whether the court should pay attention to public opinion?
Well, oddly enough, the public mostly thinks you should, but only by 54%. 46% say the court should ignore public opinion. That's a little higher, 10% higher saying pay attention to us than it was in 2020. But it's not a runaway majority by any means. And, there's a side issue about whether the court can long ignore public opinion. We had quite a fight about that back in the 30s in the New Deal period when the court was striking down New Deal legislation, which was a very unpopular set of acts by them. Eventually, Roosevelt threatened to pack the court, and the court changed its mind on New Deal legislation. So in some ways, the public eventually influences the court, but whether it does it directly or whether it does it through electing different presidents and different members of the Senate, and therefore who they confirm as justices, the path of public opinion is somewhat indirect.
Justice Thomas, in his opinion, said, well, while we're at it, we should go back, look at gay rights, contraception, gay marriage. Where are we holding on that?
Well, here the public is still quite supportive of both gay marriage and non-discrimination laws protecting LGBTQ people. 66% favor the decision legalizing same-sex marriage, 34% were opposed, but an even larger majority, 84%, say that the 2020 Supreme Court decision that said federal civil rights law protects gay, lesbian, trans people from discrimination. That 84% is a lot of support for that. So here's a case where Justice Thomas's opinion would also run into the face of public opinion. But on the other hand, the court's abortion decision also ran into the face of public opinion. We'll be working out the consequences of that through the political system, through state and federal elections, and eventually judicial decisions for some time now.
So in the big picture, how important or even consequential is it that opinions of the court, respect for the court, has declined?
Well, I think it's very important. I think that there's a long tradition of saying that the court rests on the support and the willing acceptance of its decisions by the public, but also by elected officials around the country. The court doesn't have an army to go out or a military or a police force to enforce its decisions. So public legitimacy matters. You can disapprove of the court but not consider it illegitimate, but at some point, a deep disagreement with the court is problematic for the court. It may be that opinions evolve over time, but especially as, in particular, the abortion case goes back to state legislatures and governors to decide what policy will be, this is going to be an ongoing issue, whether it's immediately before the court or more immediately before legislators around the country.
We will be back on Thursday, July 21st, with part 2 of the results from this round of polling, focus more on the political impacts and on some other political questions like what people think of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So stay tuned. The full results of this round of polling will be on the law school's website, law.marquette.edu/poll. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. And especially thank you to Professor Charles Franklin for leading us through, what is this, the 9th round of this poll? We've had 70 state polls, man.
That's
We're
right.
hit the 100
We're getting
mark
up there.
someday.
We're going to hit 100. Then we're going to hang it up, right?
Oh, no, I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, thank you for being with us. We'll be back.